Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. So today we're pleased to have Professor Vimal Ranchhod presenting for us. And Vimal is Deputy Director of SALDRU and also the Director of our ASA South Africa node. Vimal has a PhD from the University of Michigan and researches topics related to labor, demography, inequality, and economics of education. Today, he's going to be presenting work on discrimination and horizontal inequalities in South Africa's labor market. Thank you, Vimal.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is work which is very much an idea. It's not a paper yet, and we're still even feeling our way through. But it's work which is joint between myself and Gabe, who most of us should know, and Arindam, who should be somewhere in the room, unless he's still eating. He's right, and I think there's two pieces of background here. The one is that the three of us are working on a review paper for the ILO on discrimination by marginalized groups, so race, gender, ethnicity, etc., across several countries. And in the process, we included South Africa, and I just got thinking about this again, or after a long time. But there's a second part to it, which is, and this is where it is much more cleanly an ASER type of investigation, which is, and I've got a bit of that here, is one of the things that, going back to Leibrandt and Woolard way back when they were young, is that a large part of the inequality in South African society, aggregate inequality, is labor market inequality, right? That's just kind of nice. We just accept it as a empirical fact. But these two are related, I think, in the sense that, and you can do decomposition to say how much is between and within group inequalities, and you find that, okay, a lot is labor market, and a lot of that is, in fact, racialized inequality in the labor market. But the discrimination literature is different, because discrimination is conceptually not just about differences, it's about unfair differences or unjustifiable differences based on productivity, right? And as far as I can tell thus far, we haven't really seen these two come together. Because I think that's where I'd like to take this, if possible, is to say how much of that racialized inequality, which is a substantial share of our overall inequality, is attributable, at least within these decompositional senses, to discrimination, and how much is attributable to, differences in education and differences in experience and age and things like that. And I mean, the two are parallel. The point is there's no overlap, but it hasn't been done explicitly as far as I can tell. Maybe if, we'll have lots of time to chat, but if someone has seen this, then you should tell me or ask. Okay, so this is just the outline. How do I hide this thing? Moment. Okay, with someone. There we go. Okay. Right, so quite a bit on background and context, which most of us should know here, but we have a potentially broader online audience, and so I've got a bit of stuff here which many of you will have heard me speak about now. Page one. So as I think is well known, South Africa has a long and very poor history when it comes to racial discrimination. Lots of laws, racially discriminatory laws, which actually predate, they go back to the 1800s. And then what we see in 1948 is just this amplification, legal amplification of discrimination in the labor market, in education systems, in terms of where you can learn, in terms of mobility, in terms of who can open businesses, where you can open, what kinds of businesses you can open. So we end up with this extremely stratified and segregated society, which includes discrimination, but also includes lots of other forms of discrimination outside the labor market, which reinforce, complement, and make stable the racially differentiated outcomes, right? So, and that all changes in the 90s. Many of them were actually repealed in the early 1990s, before 1994, and some were changed after that, but shortly after 94. So by the mid 1990s, pretty much all of the legal discrimination is gone. Constitutionally, the Constitution is signed in 1996, for example. I should also explain at least one definitional thing, which I don't know if it's in my slides. So, right, let me just explain. So, discrimination in the labor market, it's very particular, the definition, right? It's if people are treated differently based on their group membership for reasons that are not related to productivity, right? So if you had, for example, one group has much lower levels of education, and you found that that group has lower levels of earnings, to the extent that those education differentials are related to productivity, then you can't say this is discrimination. It might be that it's productivity related. Of course, some of it could still be, it could be both, but a priori, you just couldn't tell. And that's the key thing that, at least in economics, we focus a lot on trying to get at what's the difference that remains after controlling for productivity. And the massive challenge in pretty much a long and wide econometric literature on discrimination is we very, very, very seldom have measures of productivity. So we're talking of the important variable, which is almost always unobserved, right? Okay. So let's carry on. This is just the legal framework and policy environment that we're in the last 30 odd years. So some of these have nothing to do with discrimination per se. The Labor Relations Act does a lot of things, including primarily the way in which different organized forms of labor have to interact. It guarantees the right to unionize, the right to collective bargaining processes and strikes, and provides for institutions for conflict resolution like the CCMA. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act sets limits on working conditions, basically. So working conditions, remuneration, etc. Those are not really about discrimination. The Employment Equity Act is actually the explicit affirmative action policy, or the one that enables affirmative action. So it removes unfair discrimination, says that's prohibited, so it's a negative, right? You're not allowed to discriminate, and promotes equity, but then also allows legally for addressing historically disadvantaged groups, which includes Black South Africans who are broadly defined Black, women, and other designated groups, including, for example, with people with disabilities. The Employment Equity Act, though, had exemptions. So, for example, in the regional thing, there was, I think it was 50 firms with 50 employees or more, and a certain turnover threshold, right? And that creates a type of space which excludes a lot of potential employers and will exclude a large share, almost the entire share of the informal sector. The second thing is it didn't have quotas, it had targets. And this is important when you're thinking of policy and frameworks, because the question of how does a policy actually have effects is always like, is it a binding, is it a law, is it a suggestion, is it a binding law, is it enforced, how is it monitored, and so on and so forth. And for a very long time, firms were asked to report, like, this is our stock of people, and this is the demographic breakdown of these people, and what's our target. And as far as I can tell, that was partly related to just the kind of general realization in that time that it would have been impossible to force a really rapid shift in workforce, given that at that time, the distribution of skills and education and qualifications were very, very different. So there was some recognition that there was going to be a time path, and this allowed for that. Of course, you can ask, well, how fast is that time path, and did it achieve its fastest possible trajectory, and what's the trade-offs involved there? So the Constitution is probably the starting point. I should have started with the major law. And it just guarantees that everyone has the right to not be unfairly discriminated against on the basis of sexuality and race and religion and things like that. Then there's these other things which are going to matter potentially in the final realization of wages and earnings, which is not explicitly about the labor market, but will shape the labor market, right? So the Green Paper on Public Procurement is kind of like what precedes the BEE, which is the call for affirmative action in the government procurement process. So the idea that the state should use the resources it has and the procurement it uses to shape ownership and employment. And the Skills Development Act and Skills Development Levy is the financing model underlying the Skills Development Act, but it's about forcing, it's a tax, a payroll tax, which is ring-fenced then for activities related to skills transfer and learning for your workplace, for potentially all people, but including quite explicitly improving the prospects of previously disadvantaged persons. And then the broad-based economic BBBEE is, again, this is the formalization of that 1997 public procurement reform, which creates government incentives. It's an incentive scheme, right? So it's not forcing anyone to do anything, but it gives preferential treatment in the awarding of contracts, which can be substantial in value, to firms which have a particular pattern of ownership, a particular labor force, and so on. And it's potentially a big deal for some industries. Emma, you're going to have to remind me of time because that clock is not working and there's no clock here. And I can talk for a long time on these things, which are not really about our paper. Okay, so the question we want to answer, how big are the recent employment and earnings gap in South Africa's labor market by race and gender? And that's relating to the horizontal inequalities I talked about to begin with, right? How different are these? But then what share of these differences can be explained by age and educational attainment? And I put explained in commas, quotation points, because it's explained in a statistical sense. It's not explained in a conceptual sense or a causal sense for that matter. It's just statistically how much of these gaps we can account for. That's a good word, with these covariates. And then how does this explain components change when we include industry and occupational sorting, right? So there's quite a bit of literature in South Africa on inequality. As I said, there's quite a lot of literature there. And then I'm just going to show 2 slides from the recent South African Inequality Trends report, which we contributed to. And then there's the discrimination literature. This literature is relatively less developed, as far as I can tell. There's a few studies by Raswabe and Lacheni on race and gender, 2002 using 1999 data, Raswabe on race using PSLSD 93 and OHS 99. Rulof Berger and Rachel Jefta have 2 papers using, again, OHS and LFS. And then the one that's relatively more recent is this one by Padra and Derek Yu, which goes up to 2016, although they're focusing only on employment in that paper. The thing that comes out is a lot of these studies are quite old and outdated. Not outdated, but they're dated by the moment at which they're done and the data they're using. There's one which isn't here, which is a very recent paper by Rulof and Dieter and Rachel Jafta, 2022, on the effects of affirmative action on the South African market. I haven't looked at it yet. It's paywalled. It's kind of one of these inequities, which is super annoying. Like, you know, we're all a community and we all work on the same stuff and we need to cite each other and not do the same work over and over. But anyway, I wrote to them. I'm sure they'll share it with me. Still, it is a structural problem, no? We do all this work and we do it mostly for free for those editors and journals, and then it's paid for. Anyway, different types of inequalities. So this is from the Inequality Trends Report, the labor chapter. And I just want to highlight column 2 for each group, right? So there's males and females in each group. We're not differentiating by gender here. Just look at the employed percentage for each year, 2011 to 2017. So Black African, 38, 38, 39, 39, 40, 40, 40, right? These are adults, 25 to 59 or 20 to 59, something like that. Colored is about 10 points higher, 48, 48, 48, 49, 49, 49. Indian Asian is higher, there, 53, 52, 50, 50, 50. And then white people, 10 points higher again. So 64, 63, 62. And so you get this like really substantial differential when you look from Black African to white of 30 points almost, right? Almost a double employment rate. And if you look at earnings, so this is now conditional on having a job. Remember, we saw this big difference in the likelihood of having a job. This is still 2011 to 2015 data. What you'll see in log terms is that the distributions, we just pulled 2011 to 2015 altogether, right? There's some in between measure from that time period. But what you'll see is that the Black African distribution lies to the left of the color distribution, which then lies to the left, substantially to the left of the Indian distribution, which then again lies substantially to the left of the white distribution. I mean, by all accounts, this looks like you would find its first order stochastic dominance by race. So the means are very different, but even probably the conditional means are going to be different for any group, for any threshold going upwards. And the one thing you can't pick out from here is that these differences are really big because we're working in a log scale, right? So the point is one log unit corresponds approximately to 100% differential. So these are huge, actually. Okay, that's all just background stuff. So what do? We use data from the QLFS and the Labor Market Dynamics Survey, South Africa, from 2015 and 2020. We picked 2020 Q1 because we wanted to get as close as possible, but not into the COVID space. And we can't get, like 2023 is not yet available, and I'm not sure I want to use the middle surveys. So I'm only going to talk about data from the 22 findings. The LMDS, which is the Labor Market Dynamics Survey, is it's really a process and derived data set, which comes from the combination of pools of each of all four QLFSs from the previous year, right? So let's say you use LMDS 2020, it's going to be a pooling of the 24 quarters of the QLFS from 2020. But then they also do this thing, which is kind of untransparent, which is they impute earnings based on brackets and for missing values and things. And it's not exactly clear how they do that. Andrew, he's not in the room today, but he and Martin have talked about this quite a lot. So, anyway, for us, it's a point of departure. We accept it and we move on. Yeah. So we're going to do some descriptive statistics, some pictures, and then these Blinder Oaxaca decompositions, regressions, which then feed into the Blinder Oaxaca decompositions. Okay, so this is just a sense of what these groups look like in terms of in our sample, where what we see is share African is just over 80%, share colored and share white is small and getting smaller, and then share Indian is very small. Right? So in fact, for our analysis, we just dropped Indians because we need to have enough observations in the workforce with valid wage data so that we can actually estimate these things. And we were worried that we're going to have too small subsample sizes there. Okay, the first thing is employment to population ratio. So this is just the 2020 version of the table I showed earlier, right? And what you'll see by race, which is the first three dots, this kind of big differentials between the blue dot and the red dot, and then the red dot and the white dot. The numbers are not exactly the same as the previous ones, which is kind of interesting, but the pattern is still there. So that's kind of reassuring. And then between men and women, we also find this big differential in terms of employment probability. The women are slightly below 50%, the men are above 60% there.
This is the labor force. I mean, is this what's the age range?
25 to 59. Yes, thanks. Everything from here on is 25 to 59. And the earnings distributions by race are slightly different to the ones we saw earlier, in fact. And I mean, one of the things that I want us to do going forward is to actually examine whether they really are different, or it's just, there's some sampling error even on these K densities, right? But the point that's really interesting to me is that in this one, in the previous one that I showed, the color distribution was clearly, but slightly, but very clearly to the right of the African distribution. And here it's not so clear at all. Parts of it are to the right, but parts of it are to the left, and the means are very similar, in fact, it turns out. Whereas the white distribution is still very clearly and substantially in magnitude to the right of the two. And by gender, it is pretty stable. Men tend to earn better than women, and we'll show a little bit of the magnitude in a moment. Okay, so here's the mean outcomes in the labor force and employment and earnings. So you can look at this table by men to women, like African men to African women, or colored men to colored women, or you can look at this table just downwards where you're saying within men, what's the racial pattern, and within women, what's the racial pattern. And I'm going to focus on the last two columns. I don't have a pointer here. Oh, I do, actually. So look at the employment to population ratio. 58% of colored adult men are employed, 64% of colored men, 78, 86, right? The women is like a parallel, not parallel, but a shift down, but the racial hierarchy is still the same, 46, 55, 48, 70. Again, the Indian women, on the one hand, it's small samples. On the other hand, I'm convinced that this is probably true, that the certain just doesn't fit the pattern. It's something which we can ask Arvindam about later, but it's well documented that
does level of skills play around?
Level of
Skills, skill level and skill.
Well, in this table, no, we're just asking, does the person have a job? We're gonna get it though. Yeah. The mean earnings though is conditional on employment, being employed. And here again, there's this kind of pattern which. So African men mean earnings in 2020, 8,500. See, this is the interesting thing. Colored men, it's down here. And then Indian men, 17,000, which is like double there. And then white men substantially up again. So if you start with African and go up to there, it's almost 3 times, maybe more than 3 times, right? If we look by gender, African men to African women, so that's 8.5, this is 7. This one is 7.4 and then 7.3. It's higher, but only slightly. This one is 17 compared to 13. This one is 26 compared to 17. So within each group, the gender differential is always there on earnings. The other thing is these magnitudes, and it's going to matter. So look at this, that the second highest paid group in our society are white women, right? They earn more than any of these men on average. Yeah, so. Okay, I need to explain. I don't have a slide on this, so I need to try to explain without a slide or equation or anything what a Blinder Oaxaca does. So Blinder Oaxaca, let's see if I can do this. And I know those of you who took labor would just know this already, but not everyone might have. So it goes back to your question, right? That we're trying to think about how much of this difference, which we saw in the previous slide, can be explained by things which we think should normally correlate with productivity, right? And the immediate variable that we can think of is education or skills. Education as a proxy skill. But there's other things like age or experience, or you could include, do you live in a city or in a rural area, which should probably explain some aspects of that. And so what the Blinder Oaxaca does is it says, okay, let's estimate the wage regression. And one way to do it is to estimate it for everybody, right? So that's called the pooled regression. And then we estimate it separately for African people and white people, if that's who we're comparing. And we can ask, based on a group, one group specific, you pick one of them, whichever one, African, let's say, based on the African wage regression, how much would the wages change if they had the average education of the white group rather than African? So it's a simulation of counterfactuals within the what if parameters that you get from the regression, right? And so if let's say that, let's just assume the only thing that mattered was education, then you could ask what's the aggregate difference, and then you could ask how much of the difference would be gone if Africans had the same education as white people. And the amount that's left is the unexplained component. Yeah, so you're taking the gap and you're breaking it up into an explained and unexplained component, which is based on the covariates that you have. So the explained component is really what is sometimes called the endowment effect, because it's about the difference in the mean values of the x's, the covariates across your groups. The difference in slopes between the two groups and anything in the residuals is the unexplained component. Yeah, sometimes that's called or referred to as the discrimination component, but that's not technically correct. It's really just the unexplained component, because remember, discrimination as a definition, as a concept, was about people who are otherwise equally productive. And the issue is that if we have anything that's related to productivity, which we didn't include in our regression, which could be lots of things, then it's going to be in the residual. We can have omitted variables biases on our coefficients, but it's also unaccounted for, so it's part of the unexplained, right? So it's really just an explained, unexplained. It's also the case that the x's themselves, like education, could be the outcome of discrimination, at least partly, right? So both discrimination in the labor market, for example, there's quite a few theories, in fact, that say that if there is discrimination, then the returns to education will differ for each group. And at that point, the levels of attained education become endogenous to discrimination. So some of the discrimination is reflecting in the levels of the covariates, right? So for both of these reasons, the omitted variable bias and the endogenous regressors, people have stopped strongly interpreting as discrimination, but it is still an explained, unexplained decomposition. Yeah. Okay. So we've got three groups. We've got male, female here. We've got white African decompositions and white colored decomposition. Like I said, we dropped Indian, and we chose white as our comparison group because, well, because of our history and because, as you saw, the employment and the wage realizations are much, much higher. Right. So if we just include age, which is a proxy for experience, race, gender, and education, and we decompose by race, then we get the gap is 1.4, which is approximately double, right? And for both African and colored, 1.01, 1.04. And the proportion that is explained out of that 1.01 by these covariates is 38 to 65 and 36 to 65. So it's approximately 1/3.
Sorry, Vims, can you just interpret one of the gap numbers?
Right. So in log points, for earnings, okay, let's start with column 1 here, right? Male, female. Men on average earned approximately 30% more than women, right? When we include these covariates, the difference in covariates that is explained through our regression of that 29.3 is 0.03. So, and that's one of the things that pretty much none of this earnings differential for men and women is explained by the covariates, right? Pretty much all of it is unexplained for that set of covariates. And so similarly for race, the magnitudes are much bigger, as we've already pointed out, right? A 1 log point difference is about 100%. And of that, those covariates explain 38 out of the 1.04 points, right? So slightly more than a third is explained by those covariates. And then we added on occupation and industry for the earnings regressions, right? So what we found is that of the 29.3, naturally, whenever you add any variable, the R-squareds go up, right? But the explained, unexplained might not go up because it depends on the distribution of your covariates within the groups. Yeah. Nonetheless, 10 points out of the 29.3, so roughly 1/3 of the earnings gap between men and women is explained by, or can be accounted for by, the addition of industry and occupation, right? And for white African, this number here, which was 38.2, when we add in these additional two variables, approximately doubles or goes up substantially to 72.8. Yeah. So, and this one 36 goes up to 63.7. So substantial increase in the explained component and corresponding decrease in the unexplained component. And that just happens because explained plus unexplained has to equal to the gap, right? That's by construction. It's designed that way. For employment, we find, again, as we saw in the previous tables, there's substantial gaps in employment between men and women and white and African and white and colored. Here's a really interesting little, and almost zero, so we don't make a big deal of it, but it's negative. And what that means is that the women's what's driving that is that the women's endowments, in particular in education, are slightly higher than the men's, right? So on the X's, women, it look like they should be more productive, which is why the unexplained component then, again, because it mechanically must add up to 0.124, is 0.131. The unexplained component gets bigger, basically, because of women having higher levels of education. With Josh Maguero. Hello? I don't have any control here, so. Okay, so until who's sharing? Shamin or Haj or?
Can you say view, maybe? Will that allow him to speak?
Sorry, I'm going to allow him to speak. I'll just, let me do that.
Yes,
Yes,
Josh.
thanks. Yes, thanks, Vimal. I wanted to ask a question on the Oaxaca blinder decomposition, on the difference between the blacks and the whites. When you include the industrial occupation, you find that the percentage that is explained, the explained component increases substantially. Does that mean that perhaps that whites are employed in the more in the higher paying sectors and the blacks are relegated in the low paying sectors, perhaps? Just wanted to understand why the explained component goes up substantially when you include the industrial occupations.
Okay, Josh, that's a great question. Can you give me like a minute?
Thanks.
Thanks. So just to finish this up, on the employment side for white African is a 25 points. So year points mean a lot, right? Year in this one, in the above ones, points meant percentage differences in earnings, but here it's 25 points in an outcome variable which is scaled between 0 and 1. So a 25% differential in the employment rate is huge, actually, and 18 points. And roughly half for Africans, roughly half of it could be explained by the covariates, or accounted for by the covariates. And with the white colored margin, it's even more than that. So roughly 2/3 are explained by the covariates. Nicola?
And your two last columns are for men and women together.
Yeah, so the one is right. So both regressions have both like axes, race and gender, but the decomposition in the one case is by gender lines, inclusive of all races in the gen, and the one is by gender, by race lines, including both genders, or all genders. Okay, so here's this is in response to Josh's question, which just cleanly preempted what I thought when I saw these things. Why is industry and occupation such a big deal? It turns out that industry itself is not such a big deal. Industry explains very little in that increase on the explained component. It's really occupation. And so we said, okay, well, let's see what's happening with occupation. So there's a few things here. The first 4 columns are men and the second 4 columns are women. And those of us who work with our data will know, for example, that domestic work is without doubt one of the lowest paid sectors in the economy, right? So if you look at, now each of these columns have to add up to 100, that's by design, which means that you're getting the distribution of occupations with the of employed people from that demographic group, right? So look at domestic work, basically 0.69 men workers, domestic work, I'm guessing that's garden workers, 0.1700 here. So very little domestic work, right? In all the employed people. Amongst African women, it's 16.5 points, so 1 in 6. Amongst colored women, it's close to 10%, so 1 in 10. And then below 1% and nothing there. So really very small numbers amongst the white women. So domestic work, which is like a really low paid sector of the economy, is almost exclusively employing African and colored women. And B, it's a substantial share of all the employment for African and colored women, right? And secondly, there's 3 low paying sectors here. I just know this. I mean, you can explore the data more, it's there for everyone, but there's 3 that are low paying. One is agricultural workers, one is domestic workers, and the third is, which is probably slightly higher, are elementary and occupational workers. So let's look at this one. Even though it's very low paid, agriculture and fishery, they say skilled. There's different ways. Sun and I had to go through this for our other paper, but there's different ways you can extract it. The point is, it's actually quite a small share, labor absorbing share. So it's going to be small no matter what you do when you're thinking of the whole labor market. But elementary occupations, here we've got African men 25%. So a quarter of African men are in elementary occupations, and 30% of colored men. Very low shares amongst Indian and white men, 3%, 4%. African and colored women, 26%, 22%. Indian and white women, 1.5 points, 1.7 points, right? So you just get this very strong clustering in the sectors that are low paying, which is what Josh was asking about. Now let's look at the other side where we'd expect relatively high earners to be clustered. So managers and professionals. And here you get below 10% for African and colored men, 30%, 36% for Indian and white men. And for women, it's even less, so 3.5%, 7%. And then Indian and white women, 17 and 21%. So professionals, 3, 4, 9, 15, 5, 6, 19, 19. And so you're getting this kind of, at least empirically, this polarization into occupational categories where some groups are very disproportionately representing of finding jobs in high-paying occupations and some in low-paying occupations. And one of the things that we could think through, but we definitely can't do it with a cross-section, and this could help us with, is that, you know, it's intuitive that your previous job has an effect on what your next job will be. It affects both your wages in your next job and the types of next jobs you can get. So if you're working as a domestic worker in your first one, it's not going to necessarily give you the types of experience and exposure and on-the-job learning to transmit into other higher paying occupations. And so there's like a dynamic pathway effect, which could be very important here as well. Okay, I think that's all. Yeah. So substantial differences in mean labor market outcomes by race and gender. A large share of the unexplained earnings can be explained by occupational sorting. But I mean, one of the things that Gabe pointed out when we were discussing this is, it is true, it's a large share can be explained by occupational sorting, but there's also a large share which remains, which it's not explained by these covariates, right? It's just the unknown. And this could be due to discrimination. Of course, there's, as I explained earlier, there's the other factors like, which we just can't see, neighborhoods, information, role models, aspirations, pre-labor market factors. Anything that's not in the regression is going to be in the residual of the regression and then potentially shaping the explained, unexplained breakdowns. And yeah, that's just the last bullet point because I didn't show you from 2015, but from a substantive perspective, they're pretty similar between 2015 and 2015. Okay, that's all from us. Questions, comments, anything? Nicola.
How does that share that's unexplained compare to other countries, kind of pool of interest?
Great question. Let's ask Gabe to answer that.
So as part of the project we're doing with ILO, we are comparing South Africa, Brazil, the US, the UK, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Your question was how the unexplained component or the gaps in general, how they compare?
Or both will be nice. I asked about the unexplained component, so the potentially discriminating.
Yeah. So I'll answer briefly two interesting key points. One is that the gaps in terms of race in South Africa are like an order of magnitude different to anywhere else. Like the highest you'll find is maybe 50% somewhere else in Sri Lanka, but like 100% is way higher than you see somewhere else. In gender, it's quite similar. It's lower in the UK and in Brazil, interestingly, quite high in Sri Lanka. South Africa kind of in between. Then in terms of the unexplained components, it's remarkably consistent for gender. It's just kind of quite universal finding that almost none of that gap is explained by covariates. You see that in the old US literature, and yeah, and also that in adding industry and occupation does increase the explained, but the unexplained component remains much greater. The share of the gap for race, which is unexplained, is unusually high in South Africa. That is normally a smaller component. Yeah, South Africa and one or two other countries are exceptional, where in the unexplained being the greater share.
Interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions for Gabe?
So this is probably a question or a suggestion for the team. So, I mean, the literature that you cited earlier on from the 2000s, early 2000s, that was all of us as youngsters doing this work, right? And we saw what's frightening to me about what you presented today is that the magnitudes don't seem to have changed much from that earlier literature. Despite so many policies.
I think they probably do. That's one of the things we want to do is actually just like stack up some of the old data and some of the current data and ask, have it changed, right?
Yeah.
My guess without doing it yet, I think they probably have changed, but very little.
Yeah. So that goes to my next point, which is that the big critique of Oaxaca Blinder is, aside from selection bias and stuff, which you can't do much about, it's about the fact that at different quantiles of the wage distribution, the discrimination effect may be different. And that means in terms of your sensitivity analysis, in the sort of cross-sectional sense, that's one thing that might be worth investigating. The second extension in that literature is doing Oaxaca blinder decomposition with matching, so that you kind of start looking at if you set up sort of similar types of groups with propensity score methods, and you then started evaluating them, you get a different dimension of the sensitivity, which is like this kind of a group where, because you can't control for that unexplained components really well at the aggregate, perhaps even at the quantile level, that you can do it in the synthetic matching way. And I think both of those extensions could be really useful, especially because, again, like coming up to an election, the political consequences of these findings are really big. And I think it's our job as academics to really, when we do this work, to get into the very frontier of it, because it's just explosive. I mean, it's an explosive consequence that over 30 years of democracy, you're seeing wage differentials of this magnitude. And if we believe it, we have to really back it, because then the call for more sort of dramatic policy implications is just going to get louder and louder. So, I mean, I think it's fascinating work, and I think I'd love to see sort of just a few more robustness tricks there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I mean, the one thing that at least those old 2010 and preceding papers don't do, which, I mean, we just did, you say we were young then, but the literature was younger also. So like a lot of these kind of reweighting and kernel non-parametric estimators are very young, new techniques. And now that's certainly one thing you can do, which will account for, like you're saying, seeing counterfactual distributions, and maybe there's certain pockets of the distributions where you can see much clearer than just the mean, right? So because even if you did quantiles or any particular percentile, you're still anchoring ad hoc on particular positions, whereas so that can be done, and it's already prepackaged, in fact. So it's kind of great. You take old data and new method, and you can get new insights, right? Yeah, the political issues, I mean, let's first wait, like you said, let's first wait until we're sure of what we're saying before we say it.
Just on the one follow-up question that I did have, but not so much sort of on the political stuff, but more on the questions of the sort of legislative, the expectations of how inequality should have evolved. So if you've got Black economic empowerment, you expect inequality to rise amongst historically disadvantaged groups, right? Because of the fact that you started off from a low base, and post 1994, all these policy interventions were done, and it was designed to impact particular groups. So in that respect, what's also going to be useful is to see those differentials evolve, like what the evolution's been over time, but at certain points in the distribution, because my sense is that, a lot of that legislation, which started out as targets, the BEE legislation, almost became quotas in large companies. So at the very top end of the distribution, you're going to have seen a lot of inequality evolve. And at the same time, there might still exist discrimination, even at the 99th percentile. Now, you're not going to have enough statistical power because the sample sizes are so low there. But again, this interaction of inequality plus discrimination, I think, is really fascinating, because you've got this new driver post-94 of inequality, which is BEE. And then at the same time, you've got these persistent wage differentials. Now, if these wage differentials between race at a particular quantile are staying stable over time, then for me, what that would suggest is that the legislation isn't really making that much of a difference in these bigger companies where the legislation actually pertains to. And that's a different kind of policy implication. So the interaction of the inequality as well as the discrimination, I think, is fantastic. And it suits ACA and SALDRU's work perfectly. But I think there's a ton of stuff that can be done here. So I'm very much looking forward to ILO.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else in the room? Yeah, are you sharing that, or do I?
I'm monitoring it. Yeah, if there are two raised hands, and then there's a couple of private questions. Maybe deal with Josh and Shijoike.
CJ, hello.
Yeah, hi Vimal. I do think maybe Josh will go first. Because I hear that he raised his hand first.
No, thank you. I think Vimal answered my question, so you can go ahead. Thank you.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Hi, Vimal. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for an interesting presentation. Maybe the one I'm just asking is about, personally, I don't know how to deal with it myself. So I just want to know whether you have any thoughts on that. You did mention that possibly some of the X's there are already possibly products of discrimination. And I will imagine, I just want to know whether you have any idea how you can incorporate that in a typical Oaxaca blinder. I will imagine I'm talking about a more causal kind of analysis, or whether, you just want to stop here. I'm just thinking about ways to further improve the policy sort of value of this important work, that you're doing. Thank you.
Right, so I don't know how you would try to do that. We're certainly not thinking of that, but so like, for example, the kind of standard one, even in the international literature, is about discrimination in the acquisition of human capital. So schooling and options for schooling and things like that. In the South African literature, you do read quite a bit on people talking about education quality and school quality. Nicola's done some of the better work on that, perhaps the best work on that, actually. So things like, I mean, again, with education quality, there's two issues. One is that the quality aspect is often, again, a missing variable and an omitted variable. But there's also potentially discrimination just in A, how much schooling you get, and B, in the US literature, which we, again, haven't gone into that type of detail, people ask, like, what did you study and what were your majors and what did you take at high school level? And so kind of just aggregating and unpacking the types of education rather than just a singular education variable. But your question is about the effects of discrimination on those outcomes. And I don't know if anyone, rather, let me say it like this, nobody that I know of has actually tried to map how much does the discrimination in the education system affect educational outcomes, and then how much does it then feed into these types of gaps. That I don't know of. Conceptually, it should be possible because this is just a projection. It's a simulation based on covariates and X's. So you could plausibly do it, but I haven't seen it actually.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, that's also the challenge I have because I have not seen it done. So I just wanted to know your idea. And thanks.
Thanks.
Can I read you two online questions?
Shoot.
Okay, so the first is from Newman Tekwa, who says, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Coming from a social policy perspective, I might be interested to hear the policy implications of the findings from this research. And then shall I give you both? Kind of similar.
Sure.
So the second one is a little bit also more of a suggestion for further research. It's worth looking at it province by province. This is Crystal Duncan Williams from Youth Capital. I'm interested to understand how one's social connections affect one's earning potential, even within the same race group. And just thinking about how we can unpack this using the data sets you've used. And I think proximity to economic opportunities are one way to look at this. Interested to hear Vimal's thoughts. And also connect you to after this to talk more if that's a long answer.
I know Crystal.
Oh, you know Crystal?
Yeah.
Okay.
So see the policy, I mean, there's no direct policy here. The policy that you can get a priori is that if you found it's mostly about the endowments, then you ask yourself, how do we try to get a more equal distribution of endowments? So if it's about schooling or if it's about health, like health, you could include if you got enough variables on health, then you can, and that's really what's explaining the differences, then better health or better nutrition or better screening and better clinic allocation and things like that. If it's unexplained, it's a bit harder because it's unexplained. Right? If it's truly discrimination, then you need to ask, like, what's the drivers of discrimination? And there's two broad, are we time up? two broad kind of classes of models. There's statistical discrimination and preference-based discrimination. You can outlaw it. It's not clear how much you can do beyond something like our Constitution and our Employment Equity Act, which is already outlawing it. So outlawing it again is not going to help much. But you can then devote resources to actually enforce it, because it's not just about law, it's about the implementation of the law, right? So I mean, we know from like minimum wage literature, there's tons of non-compliance and it's too big and we just don't have those type of resources. But you can make examples if you find egregious violations, and then that starts to filter down. One of the things we point out in this ILO paper is that the burdens of proof are actually really high. It's quite hard to show that someone is being discriminated against, unless people put it in writing or now with email and stuff like that, which does happen occasionally. But there could be a lot more discrimination than is easy to prove in a court, right? And so enforcement is not a straightforward thing for the whole market. Yeah, Crystal, the point of provinces, that's an interesting one. And regions within provinces, I think you're right. Networks, it's really interesting. I'm sure you're right. Listen to me, I'm sure as a matter of faith, you're right. Without much data is the problem. There's two neat pieces of data from elsewhere, but they don't feature in this type of analysis. The one is a really good paper by Jeremy Magruder using CAPS data, and I think CAPS, and it has to be CAPS, right? And he's looking at the likelihood of sons being employed in occupations that their fathers were employed in, and how much does variations in those occupations or industries affect the likelihood that the sons get employment. And he finds that the network effects within families are really quite substantial in understanding how our labor market works, right? So that's one of the very few papers that have managed to get a tractable estimate on this. And then there's something else from NIST. So this one you can do easily, but it's just a cross there, which shows that when I did it in wave 1 of NIST for 2008, approximately half of all employed people found their jobs through some form of a pre-existing context, which could be friends and family or your previous employers, or like that's socially calibrated, the job finding process. So that's a big deal, because if networks matter so much, and if you're starting out with bad luck, just pure bad luck in a locality or a network or family where there's entrenched poverty and unemployment, it makes it so much harder. I'm not sure how to map from that into the discrimination literature, but certainly it is part of the inequality story. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up there, Vimal. Can you not include regional-based controls in your lack of blinder decomposition?
Yes, we can. We totally can, and it's very easy, straightforward.
Maybe off-birth.
Hey?
Maybe off-birth. Regional birth.
Yeah, I mean, we can do all sorts of things actually, because it's not limited. Whatever data you have, you can use, right? The one thing that becomes a challenge, and this is why it's not a good idea to just add stuff, is that at the end of the day, what you really do need is enough variation in the key thing you're interested in. You need enough sample size once you think through all the different ways you're cutting the data to have variation to cleanly, or at least hopefully reasonably well, estimate the wage by race, right? So just adding things is not a free hit, actually. You know, I know, like in Woolridge, he explains that adding in an irrelevant regressor is not a big deal because you lose 1 degree of freedom or something, and it's not going to create bias. But that's when you're interested in, you're not really interested in that framing in the error components. This one is all about how much you can explain that. Anyway, anything else or anyone else? Thank you.
So our time is up. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here and our online participants as well. We hope to see you at our next SALDRU or ACER seminar.